So I don't really have an agenda for this. I wanted to have a discussion. Um, and this especially is for those on the call who are not from Google, but it also is especially for those who are from Google. So it's especially for everybody here. Everyone here is special in this discussion, as you are all the time. Never forget that. Really, I wanted to build on what we did last December when people got into a room and learned about AMP for the first time in many cases and had ideas about how to make AMP more amenable to more contributors from outside Google. As Joey pointed out yesterday, there are about 1,100 contributors to AMP, which is a large number of people, but also most contributors contribute for a single component for their company or a one-time, two-time basis. There are a lot of folks who aren't from Google who make a lot of contributions. We want to have more of that because really the goal of AMP, as everyone on this call knows by now, is to be a thing for the community to use to make better websites, not something else. This is why now AMP is part of OpenJS, under the OpenJS family. So I got some suggestions before about things that we could do as people that are part of the core AMP group to make it easier for people to contribute. And some are quite different from things we do right now, and some are pretty similar. So I'll list a couple of things here that I just put in these bullet points. I got a lot more suggestions than this in December. This is my distillation of the suggestions into a few bullet points. But mostly I want you to discuss and think, or think and discuss in your preferred order. So one thing, for example, a lot of people were there from Node back in December. I guess Node has code and learn events in various places in the world where people can get together and learn how to contribute to Node. So those who have contributed to Node before get together with people that haven't contributed to Node and help them learn how to do it. Another thing that was a cultural change that people recommended is when someone makes a feature request, the proper response is not to say, we can do this, but to say, please do it yourself. And if you have trouble doing it, we'll guide you to do it. This would be a large change. Of course, people regard AMP as this thing that people at Google kind of make for them. They can complain about it and make requests. I've tried this before a bunch of times, implement it yourself. It doesn't really have much of an effect most of the time, but it does seem to change the discussion because people realize they can do it themselves. And that's a kind of a big change. In fact, actually, in December, someone was there from a project who said that he knew a person from a project that was now popular, and this person was doing all the work for this project. People would make a lot of feature requests. He was doing all the work himself. Finally, he ignored all feature requests. This forced people to actually make changes themselves. We can't go that far, but it's just an example of one way to shift the culture in some way. If you have thoughts on these things, which are kind of a bit radical in some cases, then please share your thoughts.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed that I've sometimes been surprised that people are surprised when we do the road shows and things like that, when we say, hey, it's open source, this is something that you can add yourself to get in there. So I don't know how much of it is just a messaging thing that this is an open source project versus just a way that people are thinking about it. On the other hand, it always feels a little bit like a little bit of a cop-out for me whenever somebody is like, hey, we want this new feature, and I say, well, you can implement it yourselves, and then they stop talking, because then it feels like, oh, well, then, obviously it's a lot of work and things like that. So figuring out how to, nudge people to help out, because, we are, even though there are a lot of people at Google working on the project, it is still a limited set. Like, we do still have a long list of things that we think could get done and would like to get done. So there is just the reality that we can't do everything that people suggest on our own, but having the open source and having that as an option is good. One thing that I think is helping, like you said, let each new contributor pair with a seasoned contributor. That is something that we've really tried to do in the documentation. We've even given that name a role. I think we call it the reviewer or guide or something like that. And the idea is that whenever people come in, we do find somebody that can kind of help them through that process and guide with those things. I'm not, I think it's worked well, but not to the extent that there's been a radical shift in what percentage of AMP code is written by Googlers versus non-Googlers, which obviously we would like to change a little bit.
I think it's based on what you were saying over there, that scaring people away isn't good. But the idea of inviting them to do it with us would be one thing. And if we have some sort of nice document describing the guide process, we also could link to that document if that exists and say, here, we can actually help you do this.
Yeah, I would also say that, maybe not sort of related to this point, but I think a lot of the infrastructure projects that Ryan presented earlier today have also been a big help in this direction, where we've used tools to make some things that can make a big open source project like AMP feel and welcoming a little bit better. So for example, the owner's bot, like that used to be one of the biggest hurdles for people. They would write code and submit a PR, but they couldn't, because of the way GitHub permissions work, they couldn't assign it to anybody. They didn't even know who to assign it to. And now it sort of just automatically goes to the right people, which is great. And like Ryan's saying, if you create a feature request, you can do try assign. If somebody creates a feature request, you can then try assigning it to them, which will also send them an invite so that the issue can be assigned to them. And so there's a lot of these sort of automated tools, I think, that have helped out in making it feel like people aren't as completely lost whenever they come in to do these things. Hopefully people have found it useful.
That sounds like it's really helpful. I'm curious if people on the call who are AMP contributors already have worked with anybody new ever to help them contribute something to AMP. Have people experienced this before?
I'm newish on the AMP team, so I could say from that side, there were a lot of things that like you just don't have permissions to do until you've done a certain amount of PRs, and it makes starting kind of hard if you don't have someone there to like help you. And like, because I'm on the team, I have like someone mentoring me and helping me contribute. But I imagine for someone who's outside of the team who doesn't have that like content, you're like, what do I do? How do I do this? It won't let me assign someone. It won't let me do this. Like, how do I, join?
I guess if there were enough people like you who had this experience, who weren't working at Google, this would have evolved in its own course, because there'd be a strong need for it. The need may still be there. We just may not be aware of the need. I don't know. I talked to a company recently that there was someone who wanted to use their pixel essentially in AMP. I was trying to use AMP script to just take all their JavaScript and shove it into AMP script. And it didn't work, of course, because what the JavaScript actually did was put a new script on the DOM and then run that. So of course it didn't actually work. I talked to the company finally. I told them, if you want to make an AMP analytics version of this, it's not hard to do, it turns out. You just have to do it. We'll give you a guide. And they were like, oh, well, look at our roadmap and look at our Jira stories and things and think about it as a way of saying, it seems complicated, we'll never do it, sorry. But people have to see there's a need of some sort in those cases. I guess plenty of companies have contributed components for their own video players and analytics and so on. Although analytics has lagged in ways I don't quite understand.
Ben, there's a comment from Sarah. Are you able to see the chat?
I wasn't looking at the chat at all, but I should be. I've got to find the chat. Yeah, all right, hold on. Oh, look at this, there's 5 things in the chat because it hides this from me. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing, that if we had a blog post about the steps, the entire life cycle, as you're saying, that would be very helpful. Someone suggested last time they make a video about this, but I think that any kind of documentation, and it's easier to make a blog post than a video usually. That would be good. Taking some notes over here. Then there's like cultural changes. Okay. Caroline's saying that it's easy, there's a lot of thorough files about this, but maybe not easy to find these things.
Yeah, to a certain extent, it's almost like we might have too much documentation and too many ways of entering. And so like, Like it's almost like we should just point people to Alan's talk and say, "Here, follow this," and this points out to some guys, and that might be a fair way of starting.
It's hard to find stuff online, especially you're looking through GitHub. It's just hard to figure out what's important. Yes, a big start here. Honestly, amp.dev could probably do that in some way if people do ever find the contribution path through amp.dev instead of through GitHub. I don't know if they do. So a couple more things on this. I think the general thing people talked about before was a cultural shift, which would be challenging for us to make, but not impossible, which would be, people think, okay, this is the thing that Google controls. And if you want to make changes, Google will decide whether you want to do it or not. To change that culture, so people just thought, if I want to add AMP, I can just do that, unless I mess it up in some way, in which case I'll be told not to, but more like defaulting to yes. It was discussed that about 5 years ago, Node had a default to no culture. People would say, hey, I wanted to contribute to Node. And people would say, who are you? Don't do it. We don't know who you are. We don't trust you. It became insular. And they've tried to really change that since then to actually encourage contributions. So again, if there are people that want to contribute, this can be done. If there aren't those who are trying to contribute in the first place, it's harder to do that. But a cultural change of some sort would be interesting.
Yeah, I'd be interested. I think that this is definitely an interesting idea. I'd be interested in like knowing the times or knowing the instances where we've said no, but then where there wasn't a good reason. Because a lot of times I know that the times when somebody proposes something and we say, we can't do that, it's because it really goes against AMP's design principles. Like it's something that's just going to slow down the page load a lot, or they're trying to create a custom component for their video player, even though they could just use the AMP video component, things like that. But if there are cases where there was something that weren't doing those things, but we were still saying no, I'd be really interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah, my guess actually is that from what you're saying, what I've seen so far is that probably isn't the problem. Probably is more people just don't want to contribute to AMP in the first place. Don't ever consider it in the first place. And that probably is a culture shift we have to make. Of course, it's hard to actually change culture. I've done anthropologists who say you can't just change culture. Culture is this weird thing. You can't just move it somewhere once it exists. That's the problem we have, trying to get people to think of AMP as their own thing they can contribute to. So but actually, I have the opportunity to do that. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Chris.
AMP and Node actually share something quite in common when it comes to this. So Node has a small core philosophy in the way that it operates. This is broad strokes, right? And please don't quote me to say this is how it actually is, but broad strokes. Node has a small core philosophy in general. So the idea is that you don't add a lot of, say, userland features into the core of Node to keep it small and focused. It operates more like a kernel than an operating system, right? AMP is fairly similar in the same way, right? The components that exist are kind of the core components that you need to build out an experience. And the one-off things that you need that are specific to your domain are not designed to be part of AMP's default experience, but instead represented uniquely within your domain using AMP script and using CSS. I think if we want to shift our mindset to be something that's more about open first, say you want to be able to create things by default and use them, then we need to pursue different avenues around performance guarantees and other parts of the experience. So it would be a radically different framework, a radically different thing to shift in that direction. Not to say that's wrong, or there's, it's the one way is the right way or the other way is wrong. But it would be significantly different. And that's kind of, I think, what you were alluding to with it would cause a lot of change.
One other thing I wrote down here as an idea as I was making the summary, at least what you were just saying, which is that people before were saying they were surprised they couldn't just make their own components for AMP and use them themselves, and they couldn't just customize AMP however they wanted to. And of course, the reason is that, as you say, AMP is like this kernel, and you don't want to have people add tons of things to it. I remember what happened to MIP in Baidu's MIP in China. They like everything that came to them, they accepted everything. I guess they had thousands of components after a while. And it became not useful for anybody because there was so much stuff in it. But with Bento, things really will change. And if we really provided a way for people to understand how they could actually take AMP's components, make their own similar components using some sort of similar mechanism and use them together, that could be a whole chance to restart the conversation. I don't know how that would look specifically, but I think it's a big opportunity. So I don't know how that would look, but if you could, you know, I don't know if people would want to fork the AMP repo and add their own components to it privately and use that in a bento kind of way, or just simply add their own components using the same sort of, you know, building tools we have for building AMP components.
Yeah, it actually makes me think back to the kickoff talk yesterday that where Malta, on one of the slides said, you know, even though I presented it, Malta wrote the slide. It was about how, you know, food for thought. And has AMP reached the point where it's fairly feature complete? Like it's got most of the features that you need, especially I think in the bento world where, you know, you can create these one-offs that aren't generic for other people, but that you need for your thing. It is an interesting way of thinking about it where, you know, for the AMP core, maybe we do shift and start focusing a lot more on just the performance of this core set of things and not so much on trying to add a bunch of new features.
That'd be nice, I think, because I think AMP grew a lot when it first was created and it's grown since then, but really, yeah, there's thousands of possible interactions you can create on a site, and it shouldn't be AMP's job to make all those things possible with components.
I think that you know, a lot of benefits probably will come out from making you know, putting a wall between runtime and components. Exactly what it will look like, it's a little bit harder to say because, as we know, just web components APIs on the web today are not sufficient at all to be running by components. So there's definitely a big layer there to support it. But that being said, you know, if this was still felt very isolated, basically all we provided was a relatively thin wrapper around a React component, say, that maps it to DOM and just functions by itself. It could change a lot of conceptual aspects here.
Yeah, I was thinking also about wondering what we can learn from the lessons of Polymer, where Polymer succeeded and where Polymer did not succeed, and where React has been so successful, the whole different model of components to what Polymer provides. And my guess is React just feels easier to kind of just make your own stuff, as well as use things you find lying around. Making your own component in React is super easy.
I'll be curious, just looking down at some of your later points about Google, you know, AMP being a project that Google owns. That's definitely been part of the motivation as we've done the governance change over the past couple of years, and now actually officially shifting AMP to be in the OpenJS Foundation as a growth project instead of being within Google. Of course, it doesn't. Those shifts are, you know, help show that it's not meant to be just a Google project. But the fact that most of the contributors are still Googlers, obviously, it's understandable that people still kind of think about it that way. But yeah, it will be interesting to see as time goes on, maybe as we get rid of the Google CLA and now shift over to an OpenJS CLA, that those kind of things will start to feel a little bit more broken. But there's also even like small subtle things. So for example, if we hadn't done this, the contributor summit as part of the OpenJS event, like we were running our own event like we've done in the past couple of years, I would have just held it on Meet because that's what I'm used to using. And so, you know, even though maybe the rest of the world is more familiar with Zoom than Google Meet, we would have just run it on Meet because we know how to use it, and that would have been it. And so little things like that where it's like, well, okay, let's use what non-Googlers might be using today for these kind of events. I think that also helps with these things, this perception.
Someone did go through our GitHub in December and look through it and say, it feels very Google to me though. Google's everywhere, all over this thing. I feel like we tried very hard to not do that, especially for what was originally a Google project. I guess there are those who still see it that way.
Yeah.
And now looking at the Electron site just for fun, and it doesn't feel like a Microsoft site to me, especially. I don't know if Electron actually has a lot of non-Microsoft contributors, or how they've done with that, honestly.
There's more history there around the formation of Electron worth digging into separately, but it didn't start as a Microsoft project, for instance.
That is different then.
But I do think there is something to be said around the foreignness of the AMP HTML repo specifically compared to other open source projects. It is significantly different to work on AMP HTML than it is to work on any other open source repo in the UI space at this point. It uses closure compiler typed JavaScript. It has a build process that's unique and one-off and is not shared by anything else. It has a bunch of bots that act differently than other systems do. And none of these are bad traits, they're just different. And so as a result, it is a little foreign, right? It doesn't look like a normal open source project. It looks like a Google project that is now open source.
I guess
Yeah, Malta, I do think it started at GitHub. That's my memory too.
I guess probably the first step is to have folks interested in contributing to AMP more. And then if that interest begins to grow, find out how to make it easier for them to contribute. But that first step has to happen too. And perhaps Bento will do that in some way.
Yeah, there's definitely a feedback loop there. You know, if we had where even like 10% of the contribution, the code contribution was from people that didn't work at Google, I feel like the processes would just naturally start to break out of some of these Google processes because you would just always be thinking about that if as a Googler working on these things.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, Juan's asking how many of the participants here don't work at Google. It's an interesting question. Yeah, it's definitely mostly Google people that I recognize in the names. I see a few of y'all, but you know.
There should be some advantage to the Google Association, you would think, because not to be a big egotistical person or anything, but we've seen before people often want to meet Googlers. So it could be a way to actually get involved with people at an interesting company. So there could be an appeal to that.
It has been interesting, like in the road shows, you know, the AMP road shows, we go around the world, and in most locations we actually de-emphasize the Google aspect. Like we don't use Google Colors, you know, or anything like that, because it's an open source project and we didn't want to really build on that connection, except for a certain market. So like in the China market, because Google isn't a very dominant player in the Google market, or it doesn't have a very big presence in the Chinese market, having the Google name associated with the event actually attracted developers because it was something that, oh, this is, you know, they wanted to learn more about it and these kind of things. So it's also interesting thinking about as you think about a global audience, how different people might react to these things.
It's true everywhere too. You can mention it's a Google, you know, event that's going to involve Googlers. People will come for that reason, much more than for the AMP name.
I want to provide some perspective. I think like what Chris was saying, so when I first made the AMP open source project, one of my goals was to make it as absolutely mainstream as possible. And so that's why we're using Gulp, which was like, turned out to be such a terrible idea because Gulp is like just shit. Sorry if anyone here is affiliated with that project, but it's like really incredibly bad. But I only used it because it was popular at the time. And so now we're stuck with it, right? And I think, honestly, if you look at all the popular large open source projects, none of them use mainstream technology because they're all kind of old and they use some crappy stuff that's difficult to get rid of, right? I don't actually think that there's anything bad with the Google Association. Like many of us work for there. I think that the main thing to think about is since there are like 1,000+ contributors, obviously like the vast majority don't work at Google, but we don't do a particularly good job of retaining them. People just kind of come to the project and fix something that they care about. Many obviously like because they contribute a component, right? And sometimes these are literally done and then they disappear. And if you, it's not necessarily bad, right? Like things that it's completely cool to kind of you know, just do your thing and disappear. It's there's no obligation to stick around.
Well, I guess one question is what draws a person to contribute to a project in the first place? Because you don't get paid for it. You get, hopefully you get prestige, you're part of a community. Maybe it's fun being part of something that you admire. And how can that also apply to working on AMP?
Just responding to like what Sarah and Juan raised in the chat. Yeah, this definitely felt different than the contributor summits of the last 2 years. Probably a lot of that's on my shoulders in terms of how it got advertised. It definitely felt different when it was a standalone event where we had a standalone page and we're doing, you know, travel and applications and all of those kind of things. I think for next year, we'll definitely need to think about, you know, is it what exactly it looks like. Like hopefully, you know, coronavirus and COVID-19 will be a thing of the past, and we'll be able to meet in person somewhere, and that and you know, maybe with more lead time and everything, we'll be able to build that up and announce it a little bit more widely.
If folks who are on the chat there who are saying that people wanted to contribute or people are interested in doing it but don't know about this, if you know of ways to reach people that you think could be interested in contributing, you might want to come to one of these events or just meet people that do contribute. If you know good channels for that, please suggest those things. We have tried some. I'm sure there's a lot more things we haven't tried.